Hello, this is Clam.
And also Thane. We're here with a little note to let you know that Sequential Magazine has posted its list of nominees for its 2021 Comic Awards.
This year, my comic Phantomarine
And my comic, Witchwood, are both eligible along with many other cool comics.
voting on the awards is open to the public until February 28th, so go to sequentialpulp.ca to check out the full list and cast your vote.
Thank you very much and enjoy the episode.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams come true!
Excellent.
Woohoo! So, welcome. Hello, you are listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today, we are talking about retcons and reboots. My name is Rennie. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomic at Kate Blast.
My name is Delphina. I make the webcomic Somnolus, and I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Ray. I make the comics on Empyrean High and Overlord of Ravenfell, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Finn. I use they, them pronouns, and I create the webcomic Heirs of the Veil.
Awesome. So, say you're making a comic, which I'm sure many of you are listening are, and say some time goes by after you launch and you discover, I don't really like this part or this aspect anymore, or oh no, this doesn't work with the canon. I found a plot hole. What do you do?
You panic first. No.
Panic. No.
Most creators are left with about three options. You can proceed without changing anything you've already posted. You could go back and tweak a few pages, add or remove some panels and retcon the story, or you can scrap the story, reboot it, start from scratch. So today we're going to talk about each of those options, when they can best be used, and some of the pitfalls of each direction.
Yeah, so I guess to start things off with sort of our first topic, so in each of your own works, sort of how have you personally challenged sort of being able to go back and re-looking at your work, whether it's a retcon or fully restarting, and how did you know that it was time to make a change?
So some creators have a really detailed outline or script, and they just do this all in text, and they do their edits there, or they make very long buffers so they can see how the scenes combine together and add or delete scenes and stuff. And so they do all that stuff on the front end before it's time to publish them on the web. But I am a feral goblin. And I don't work with scripts a lot. I want to post everything immediately. And that's why I love webcomics, because there's really a lot of hope for us. Because editing a webcomic after it's published is like, you can just change the text, change a picture, re-upload the JPEG. And it's technically easier than almost any other storytelling medium, because you're not filming a thing, you're not printing a book.
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
yeah, it's been very kind to me. And in fact, about 350 pages into Somnolus, I wanted to run a Kickstarter to bring the first book to print. And I had a small readership, and my loyal readers were appreciative of my rough beginnings, but they would tell people to skip the first 170 pages, or
Oh.
they were confused, or certain arcs of the story, like they were focusing on certain characters and not others, and those were big red flags to me. With that kind of feedback, I really couldn't depend on people slogging through my confusing beginnings. And I couldn't justify printing it without at least taking some pass at making things better with the skills that I had developed over the last 300 pages. And it was only going to get longer. It was only going to make getting into my series harder. So that one, I definitely decided I wanted to do a reboot, and I guess it's a reboot, yeah. And my third book, I actually had an art issue where about 100 of my pages were drawn about 1 inch too small on all sides because I
Oh,
didn't understand the margins in Clip Studio yet. So I was
that's
gonna
always
have to.
hard.
Yeah, it was a bummer, and I was like, it took me 2 years, but I had to, like, redraw them because they just physically would not work in book format otherwise. So yeah, I did. I had a couple rules. I would only change any part of the story that made it confusing who the reader should care about, which characters mattered.
Hmm.
I removed story segments that didn't advance the main plot because I tend to write a lot of little side directions and hooks for myself that I don't always use. So I think of it like sanding off the rough edges with sandpaper.
Oh yeah.
Um, and I really wanted to stick to just the stuff that I was about to print in that volume, and not edit anything beyond that until I was ready to print again. And then just as long as unless it affected how people understood the story, I did not want to touch the art. If the art was clear, if it was doing its thing, even if it was a little cringy and I knew I could do better, I didn't want to touch it because that was a time sink. And the focus was not on improving my technical rendering or adding new cool plot ideas, but making everything more understandable to the reader and reinforcing my future direction.
I remember seeing a comic by you, Delphi, one time on writing types. There's the architect, there's the gardener, and you're the crocodile hunter.
Yes. I
Gotta, oh
love
crikey, gotta wrangle this comic into.
Yeah, she's a
Oh
beaut, isn't she?
yeah,
You gotta wrestle all those side plots.
that's
Mhm.
so such a just. I think that's the correct approach, though. Is like identifying exactly sort of what's most important to you and to getting the story across, and by and large that usually falls to the writing, where that's the part that's really going to carry the story in a lot of different ways. So that's very good that you're able to sort of lean on your existing readers to try and help identify those spots that needed tightening up for sure.
Yeah, for me, I rebooted my first comic partially because, well, I know a lot of webcomics start off as like role plays and collabs through friends, and let me tell you, while that can create some really cool stuff, if you happen to fall out with some of those friends, it can make your comic really difficult to work with, especially if they
Yeah.
had some of the say in the direction of the story, especially if you don't happen to agree with some of the directions of the story. um, so that was actually one of the main reasons why I rebooted my comic. Even though I kept some of the characters, I did actually minimize their role for multiple reasons, partially because the cast was just honestly too big for me to handle at the time. Um, so I did actually reboot that comic, but it also eventually stopped for many of the same reasons that I ended up rebooting it. So my next comics, though, I was very much anti reboot. I kind of want to change things before they go out, so I try to ensure that I have a big enough buffer that if I see something's not working, that I can just cut it. And I try to focus on pretty much things that need to happen. And if I don't find something enjoyable when I start making it, I'll try to find out if I can do that story beat in another way where I do find it enjoyable, so I don't have to um, pretty much be unsatisfied with my work once I get it done.
Yeah, making sure that you have that passion for your work, I think, is going to be the biggest key towards long term sustainability with any sort of project, especially comics, where it's you should feel good about what you're writing for the most part, and getting through each scene. Of course, there's going to be panels and things that you're like, oh no, I have to draw this. Ugh. There's always going to be those, but overall, the stuff you're making should bring you joy, and both in the creative process and afterwards. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just like if you're not making money, which a lot of us are not, like the passion is going to be what carries you through, and if you're not passionate about it, yeah, it's just never going to work.
Yeah, it's like for me, I just cut out like an entire chapter because I really wanted to get to the next chapter, and I'm like, why do I need this story beat right now? And I'm like, I really don't. I can introduce it later in another way to where I find it more enjoyable. So I can just get to this point right now. And then the next point I can probably fit in a lot smoother than I could before anyway. So I do think having that wiggle room is actually really good.
So I think that already ties in with how to avoid having to reboot. Just keeping your own work enjoyable for yourself.
Yeah, being self-indulgent is definitely a thing that I think webcomics benefit from a lot. And if you're just not enjoying yourself, you should probably re-examine what makes the work enjoyable for you, how you can get it to be more enjoyable for you, um, and just make some cuts or some changes.
And those changes don't even have to be huge either. And I think when people get so into the weeds on making those retcons or changes, um, they think it has to be this huge thing, and it really doesn't. It can be just a simple change in how you word something, or the phrasing, or the dialogue, or even adding a page somewhere to add more context. Um, I do want to ask Finn what because I know you've gone through several versions of some of your stories. So how have you personally approached retcons and changes and stuff?
Yeah, so Heirs of the Whale is basically the reboot of two comic projects I did with my husband. We kind of started out in 2008 or 2009, and the first version was actually published by a small independent publisher in Germany. We didn't really have like the best experience, and
Oh no.
yeah, a huge reason why we ended up rebooting that first comic was that we wanted a fresh start. We still kind of like the characters, but we wanted to move on from that publisher because, yeah, the experience was quite bad. And then we went on to Straya, which was basically the second version before we started with Heirs of the Veil. And with Straya, it was like, okay, so in the beginning, we didn't really quite know how to approach certain things. The story was quite different. We had actually planned for it being more of an episodic story with less of an overarching plot, and that kind of changed. So we were when I think the fifth chapter came around, we were kind of scrambling to try and make it all make sense. So our first idea was to basically do a soft reboot to say, okay, we will end the story and then go into a second arc. And we will make the second arc so that new readers can get into it without having to read the first arc. And when we noticed that that was kind of impossible in the way we have set it up, we decided on a reboot. So there was a lot of consideration, and yeah, it was a very deliberate choice because we were like 250 pages in, and it kind of hurts when you like realize you have to throw that away to make the story better.
Yeah, but also I think the good thing to keep in mind that I definitely appreciate from a lot of people who have gone through that is, those pages, even if they have to get scrapped, still very important as far as learning. And I think that a lot of creators just try and remember that. And I think that's the mentality to approach that.
Yeah, they showed you the direction you don't want to go, and or like maybe you did, but you just found out so much about the characters and stuff. Like I don't think you really know your characters until you start putting them in stories and situations. I think it's so difficult from a character's perspective to like really get in their shoes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too is you're not always going to be the same person that
No.
you were when you started a comic. So I do think it's important to definitely realize that you're not always going to like the same things that you liked when you started. Like, that's one of the reasons why I ended my first comic is, and I tried to make Ravenfell to be something that I could actually grow with.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when we started Straya, it was pretty hetero, and both Jasper and I kind of had our queer awakenings while working on
Yes.
it, and we kind of wanted to reflect our own experiences in our work. So that was also one of the reasons why we decided to reboot it.
Yeah, that's so awesome, and it's how I love seeing those stories sort of change and be like, yeah, okay, this is fine, but let's make it gayer, make it reflect more of us, and that is like, it's one of my favorite things that I've seen in webcomics is when you see the creator not only grow with their work, but have their work help them grow, and having that feedback loop there, that positive feedback loop is so great, but it also is super helpful to recognize and sort of let it happen and then look at your work and be like, okay, how do I make this one the best it can be, but two, the thing that matches me the most. And I think
Yeah.
that's so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, and we're just surrounded by media made with like kind of this heteronormative messaging and norms and stuff like that. And the tropes that we pull in, we don't even realize we're doing it until you get a little more experience and you're like, why are the guy and the girl in love? Like, I'm just doing that because that's what I saw and that's what I'm repeating. And maybe that's not really reflective of my own experience.
No, I actually, before I started making Cape Blast, when I first started writing sort of an attempt at a webcomic in like around 2015, um, it was right around the time I was starting to come out to myself, and then started to come out as a trans woman in the world, and a lot of that story was me processing the stuff that was happening in the moment, and but that also meant that the story was in a very fluid state. And I did reach a point where I was like, one, maybe I'm a little too close to the subject matter. But two, I am maybe biting off more than I can chew. So let's go back and try a different story. So it was a moment where I was like, okay, let's walk away from this story. Doesn't necessarily mean it's gone forever, but let's try something else. And that experience of, I had like 3 or 4 different false starts where I'd make like 6 or 7 pages and then abandon it and be like, no, I don't like this direction anymore. And I wouldn't get very far. So then I went and started to try and be like, okay, let's do something shorter. And then I started doing Cape Blast to sort of something shorter to sort of get my feet wet and, sort of get into it. And that short 30-page story ended up turning into, something much, much bigger. But it was because I was able to have that experience earlier where I was able to recognize, okay, here's the direction I actually want to go, and here's how I can be sustainable and dive in. And I think that's so, so good.
Yeah, I think honestly, webcomics being messy is kind of a good thing because a lot of people are just figuring things out while they're doing it. So you can find out, oh, maybe this isn't working, or I don't have the skill to pull this off right now, so I'll stop it and work on something else, and that's perfectly fine. Like, my first comic was on freaking lined paper. It never actually made it onto the web. Um, and like Delphi said, it was hetero as hell because that's really all that I saw. And I'm actually kind of wondering, maybe one day I can revisit those characters, and it's going to be a lot gayer. Now,
Yes.
since that was technically my first comic, my first web comic, it was already pretty damn gay, but it had a lot of tropes that were found in a lot of, like, say, BL manga that were very common at the time and probably wouldn't be very acceptable in this, like, day and age, really, which is another reason why I kind of outgrew it, because it had a lot of tropes that just they did not age well. And
No.
that's something you should probably also consider when you're making a webcomic or doing retcons, is the tropes that you were used that you, like, grew up with might not age very well in the future.
Yeah. But say you go you do those things and you make those decisions in your writing, whether it's tropes or dialogue or anything, and you realize, gosh, I really want to change this. How do you go back and change those past pages without confusing longtime readers?
I just confuse them. No, 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 no. I mean, I don't believe in apologizing for things that, like, I'm doing for my own benefit and I'm doing for the benefit of the story that I want to tell. I
Hmm.
really don't have a lot of shame in that. But it is true that your readers, like, got into your comic for a reason, so there must be something there that somebody liked, and tweaking the dials might change that experience. So that's where you really want to pull in beta readers, and you want to pull in people who have been following your comic and other comic peers to say, what were the strengths of this direction? What would you really be gutted if I took out?
Hmm.
Um, I think that can be an important way to just keep the experience the same, because the reader isn't going to remember the details usually. They're not going to remember, like, a whole bunch of your comic, especially if you did what I did and just, like, do hundreds of pages and then go back and change it, like, 500 pages later. Like, no, nobody remembers that. I don't remember that. Um, but but yeah, as long as it feels the same, people will be okay with those changes, and you can and respect those changes.
Yeah, and if people do get confused later, like the readers that really, care about the story and are like, what? They will go back and be like, wait, I thought I remembered something like this. They will go back and they will see you've made a change. And and then it'll all be fine. So definitely, you know, it's definitely good to, use those creator communities that you've been able to build and get those inputs on sort of how to maintain the feeling that you've built while still, building towards the canon that you want.
Okay, I'll say this right out. I really don't change previous pages. After my failed reboot of my first webcomic, I've kind of been very trying to get stuff how I want it before it even goes out. So I very rarely retouch pages. Like, I redid the first 2 pages of Overlord and Ravenfell just to see how I improved, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll redo some pages, and then I realized it was like 450 pages long, and I'm like, no. So I
Protect
really
yourself.
just don't really touch pages unless it's like a typo or I forgot to color in something.
Yeah. I mean, and that's also like making sure that you have a healthy respect for your own time too, because barring a few exceptions, most webcomic creators are doing this as a side passion project. Have like daytime jobs or something, and a lot of other obligations, and cranking out 100 pages of changes is a ton of work. And for some people, I know for myself, that would take a year of work, which I don't know if I'm going to be willing to put that in unless someone's paying me to quit my job. So, and even then, I'd be, very reticent, in some ways. So I think it's very important to have that sort of healthy respect for sort of your own time and, moving and focusing on moving forward in the story
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that was said, especially to the respecting your own time. In Heirs of the Veil, I think most we did so far was go back and change some text or fonts, mostly like to improve readability or make certain things a little bit more clear for the readers. And I think story wise, I would not even change that much if I'd go back. I basically just would change the art of on a few pages, mostly to make it a little bit more streamlined, to make the flow of the pages go a little bit better. Um, but yeah, that's a lot of time. That's a lot of commitment. So I can totally understand if people don't want to do that.
Yeah, it's definitely a commitment for sure, um, and just making sure that you have that balance. So one of the things that did come up earlier that I do want to circle back to is something that we like to call reboot hell, where a comic seems to get stuck in this cycle of posting a few pages or a few chapters and then starts over several times and just doesn't seem to get out of that first chapter blues. Uh, what are some things that you can do to avoid getting stuck in this, while still being able to go back and make those changes?
Oh gosh. Yeah. So I mean, I think the big thing about reboot hell is you just have to remember that moving forward is more important than moving backward. If you're taking
Yes.
time away from your update schedule to fix things, make sure it's a limited time. Just set those dates right away. And then whatever you can't finish in that amount of time, just let it go. You could possibly burn yourself out and not finish updating your archives, which uh, I mean, I think that looks even worse than like a natural progression of your style when you're like, okay, I'm going to redo everything from the beginning, and then like you get 2 pages in and nope.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also think most of the time, from a reader's perspective, the readers really don't really care that much. They basically want to know how the story progresses. So most of them don't really care that much if you go back and change old things.
I think one of the beauties of webcomics is people being able to see the growth, and see, wow, this art's gotten so good since the first page. Maybe this is something I can do too, especially if you're another creator. Um, and I think it's not a bug, it's a feature. So lean in on that and like keeping the scope of the changes to something that you can manage. Can definitely help, making sure you don't get stuck in that rut, because the burnout from reboot hell is real. And I have seen so many people sort of like fall out of comics making entirely because uh, the process of rebooting and rebooting and rebooting kind of broke their heart and, stole the story from them, which is absolutely heartbreaking to see. And so just it's you got to not let it get to you too much, and just sometimes you just got to live with some of the choices made too.
Yeah, I kind of break it down into like you can do typo and detailing sweeps, which is kind of what Ray was talking about earlier in terms of like I forgot to color something, or you know, this person was wearing a hat last panel and they're not now, so I better change that because that's just like objectively wrong. And then you've got like kind of the rendering sweep, and that's kind of the place on the process where people get tired and stuck because you're always going to be a better artist no matter what you do. And yes, I can always draw this character better because I've been drawing them hundreds of times, but that's not going to really affect the enjoyment of the story as much as changing things for the sake of visual clarity or just themes, bringing things in line. I think a lot of times for me, especially when I first started Zombulus, it was very dark. And
Oh
people are
wow.
surprised that it is like a story about angels and demon type people, and I was going like in those tropes, like, oh, he's very evil, he uses this evil magic and stuff. And it very quickly turned into something like, no, this is not the tone I want. This got very boring for me very fast. Um, and I think that's a good reason to reboot. But yeah, it can get very exhausting if the reboots that you are considering are just going to take a lot of time, rendering time. I think rendering time is just bloats everything.
Agree. And it's, that's why, like, we've said it a couple times already, but that's why, when if you're going to go back and sort of, I think a lot of the reboot hell stories that we see are people going back and redrawing whole chapters, or going back and redrawing, way too much. Um, Maybe because they feel like ashamed of their earlier work, but like definitely don't feel ashamed about that. It's, the art is what was needed at the time, and while there are probably a few little things that you can change, like the focus should be on the tone and the writing, and making sure that those things are feeding you as a creator.
I don't think anyone ever expects webcomics to be like super nice and polished all the way through. I
Oh
mean, it's
no.
really just the nature of the medium is you have a lot of people who have never done comics before getting into it for the first time. And there's definitely always going to be that growth that you're going to see. I mean, it's not even uncommon to see like published works be the same way as well. But I definitely do feel like Reboot Hell is a special kind of thing that webcomics have. Um, like sometimes you'll see, oh hey, this mangaka had a doujinshi that they're redoing into a series, and it looks a lot more polished stuff. But rarely is it like an actual true reboot hell. Um, and I've seen some webcomic artists like reboot things 6 times when they still weren't satisfied. And I really do think that having that level of perfectionism just will not make you happy.
No, and I know that's like a topic for a whole other kind of episode we could go on forever about. But I think the thing we see with the perfectionism is, a lot of people like see a lot that they see that's posted on social media and stuff these days, where it's like, wow, this art's so good, this comic's so well put together. I'm not that yet, so let me restart so I can do that. But what they don't see is the years of work put in behind to sort of craft the stories, work on their skills. And it's definitely, as a creator, you shouldn't compare your own um, full story with someone else's highlight reel. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think this is also kind of fueled by the fact that a lot of the webcomics that we see published online nowadays, they already have a very high level of art and storytelling. So they are very good. So I guess people kind of feel motivated, but also a little bit depressed that they are not on that level yet. So I guess it's also like the increase in quality over the past few years.
Yeah, I definitely do think that that's kind of like the evolution of what webcomics are, especially with like the corporate companies having a lot of their own brand styles these days as well. But it's like what a lot of people don't realize is many of these comics that are like super polished and super nice are not the first comics by these creators. Like a lot of people will compliment the art for On Empyrean High, and that's probably my like fourth comic in general, but it's my third web comic. Well, okay, fourth web comic if you include the reboot I did of my first one anyway. But it's like I've done a lot of pages to get to that point, and even then it's just takes a lot of planning, a lot of practice, and you know, and it was a very messy progress in general, and I do feel like there should be room to be messy with webcomics.
Yes, and one of the things you started to mention there too is, like, if you look at a lot of like the really popular web comics out there, many of them aren't even single people. Like some of them are working, with a huge team, or they're getting help, or like, like maybe it's even if it's just two or more people, they're not wearing all the hats, which we talked about in another episode. But uh, it's definitely like you see those comics. Like I know there's a bunch of the webtoons originals that are entire teams of like like maybe a half dozen people all working to make that, and the stuff that you can do with 6 people is a lot harder to do with one person. So you definitely shouldn't hold yourself to as a one single person wearing all the hats to the same standard that you would hold someone, who some comic that might have 6 people sharing the hats. So I guess this does sort of start leading into sort of our final question is, uh, say you're getting into reboot hell, or you're starting to make a lot of changes. How do you know when it's time to stop either making the changes, or start walking away from the comic entirely, or how do you know when it's reached that point?
Oh gosh. So I think, like I said, like tone changes. I think sometimes you're in the mood to tell a dark, gritty story, and maybe um, it, then it became lighter, or vice versa. Or maybe like you were trying to do something and you didn't have the skill to pull it off at the time. I think that's maybe a good reason to kind of um, back off if it's really not going to be the thing that you can do yet. I mean, it's negligible because you do need to practice to get better. But I think also if you're dealing with some problematic content, like we just we do pull in a lot of tropes from media that might cause unintentional harm when you repeat them, maybe even to yourself unwittingly. And we live in a very
Oh
fortunate
yeah.
time when there's a lot of information out there about how to dissect this stuff and a lot of resources. And so if you find something like that, that's a little insensitive to certain groups. Here's a character who's a total ignorant stereotype. And now that I know what I know, I hate them. Maybe that's bumming you out. Um, do what you have to do to make the project enjoyable again. And if they're a core character, that might mean like shuttering the project. Um, and we talked about it a little before, but just sometimes we have ideas that we came up with when we were in a different phase of our lives. And writing a comic about my childhood dog doesn't have the urgency that it had when I was 10.
Yeah.
And a lot of people start projects in one state, and or to Finn's point, it was a bad personal reminder of a relationship that was with the publisher that was not great, and maybe you don't want to continue that. So we're always growing and changing, going through life stuff. So when we start feeling that discomfort or that dissonance, and it's looking like it's locking us onto an identity that we aren't anymore, it might be time to move on.
Absolutely. Um, I think that's one of the things I touched on earlier too. Is if the source material is too close to something and hits too close to home as well, you shouldn't necessarily be re-traumatizing yourself, or causing yourself heartache with the stuff that you're making. And now I know that there's that auto bio about this sort of about a long range of topics is very popular these days too. But also, you shouldn't necessarily be so vulnerable as to harm yourself in the process.
See, I'm all for either shuttering or rebooting as long as you have realistic expectations. I thought I had realistic expectations for when I rebooted my first comic, but overall, it ended up being something that I eventually just had to stop because I just honestly wasn't that person anymore. So when I made Overlord of Ravenfell, I tried to have enough wiggle room in the story that I could change things a bit more easily. And even when I went on hiatus and I came back to it, it's something that I can still work on. So I definitely do feel like it's a very personal thing on whether you should reboot. But even if like you lose like hundreds of pages, I do feel like as long as you make something that you're eventually happy with, that it's pretty much a good way to go. But I'm also very much a person that's perfect is the opposite of done. So I really don't like going back and changing things that I've already finished, other than like often superficial typos and rendering.
Yeah, like that done is better than perfect is absolutely the right mentality, and especially with something like a webcomic that takes so long, is if you get hung up in a story that that either isn't working for you, or isn't going where you want it to, that's a lot of time, because as we've talked about before in this podcast, webcomics take a lot of time. So definitely making sure that the process is moving forward for yourself, um, in a way that's healthy and manageable. It's absolutely key.
Yeah, I think also adding to what Rennie said earlier, basically, you shouldn't work on something that makes you miserable. So, a good point to stop, and I think also a good point to stop rebooting, is if you notice that no matter how much you reboot your comic, you're still kind of miserable with it, you should probably stop. And I also think something that might be important is to surround yourself with people that are honest to you, that when you basically only have bad things to say about your own work, that will tell you, hey, I
Hmm.
feel this is making you miserable. Maybe it's a good time to stop. So have someone in your life that's honest with you about how you are acting towards your own work, because sometimes you get so stuck in your own rut that you might not notice that it's time to let it go.
Yeah, and like this, I know like a lot of comics is so personal, but nothing personally gets me to not read something is if someone goes and says like, oh, it's not great, like, be happy, be comfy. If you're not comfy and confident with your work, that's a sign that you need to sort of look at the process and sort of look at what makes you happy. Because if you're exuding the energy of you don't like what you're making, it's going to be very difficult to expect other people to like what you're making if you can't like it yourself.
Well, I mean, I think even if people do like it, but you don't, you're the most important person because you're the one who has to live with your
Yes.
comic for the duration of your comic. So, like, even if other people are telling you, "Oh my gosh, I really love your comic," and you're not feeling it, like, you do you.
Yeah, I definitely think that you are the most important at like reader, pretty much. Like my first
Hmm.
webcomic, probably because of all the like problematic BL tropes that were in it, was actually my most popular comic. I had a forum that had like over 200 members in it, and it was actually very active.
Wow.
um and I also got like the most fan art. I even had fan fiction in it and all that
That's
stuff.
so cool.
And it's like, I while I do miss that level of engagement, which I think partially, it's just a very different internet than when it is back
It
then.
is.
While I do miss that level of engagement, I am personally a lot happier with my current projects than I was with the one that I ended up shuttering.
Yeah, readers are temporary, you are forever. So make it work for you is absolutely the best
I'm taking
advice.
from that webcomics will make me immortal because I am forever. Ah,
Yes.
awesome.
There can be only one.
So, I think adding to a point I had earlier, to surround yourself with people who will be honest with you, I think something that can help you to not get stuck in reboot hell is to have people that give you honest feedback about your work right from the start. Because if you already have someone who goes into your work who gives you criticism, you will probably feel a lot safer and a lot better about what you had already put out, because there was somebody there already to go over it, give you feedback, and the work has already is already kind of more polished than it would have been without that feedback. Yeah, that's just what I wanted to add.
Yeah, I do think that's very important. Like, my significant other is pretty much my editor, and she has no problems telling me what works and what doesn't. So I definitely do think it's important to have someone that will give you honest feedback and pretty much can elevate your work to be better than it would be on your own.
1,000% yes.
Building
Yeah.
each other up. It's what it's all about.
Yeah, exactly. We're all in this together, and we're all here to see the end. And I know we've touched on that in other episodes too. But like having peers that are able to be honest with you, but also be kind about it, and like understand your mission and help you make your story the best it can be, is absolutely key.
If only my significant other was kind about it.
Oh,
Oh,
no.
Oh. Oh.
Oh no.
That's
They
fun.
were yelling at me for typos earlier, and I'm like, I'm sorry.
Oh no.
Well, on that, I think this is a good point to call it a wrap. This has been Screen Tones. I have been your host, Rennie. You can find my work at kateblast.com.
And I'm Delphina, and you can find my work Zombulus at zombulus.com.
And I'm Ray, and you can find On Empyrean High at empyreancomic.com, and you can find Overlord of Ravenfell on Webtoon.
And I'm Finn, and you can find Heirs of the Vale on heirsofthevale.fervorcraft.de.
And we'll see you later. So now what if we just restarted the podcast?
No, we're not rebooting the podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to Screen Tones. Please subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to also follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast.